Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a RCA involving the case around Mr. Anderson. We're gathered here to discuss an adverse event that occurred when his oxygen supply failed during a transport to the ICU. Just as a reminder to set the baseline for this meeting, our fair and just culture principles do apply. This is not a punitive process. This is an emphasis on learning from our mistakes and with the idea that we can identify process improvements to prevent similar events from occurring in the future. Well-intended systems can be faulty and lead to errors. And with a fair and just culture, it can lead to meaningful changes moving forward. So thank you for joining. And I think we can start with some introductions. I'm Josh from Risk Management, who will be moderating this RCA, and we can go around the table. And if you could introduce yourself.
The nurse manager from the PCU, and I'll be speaking on behalf of my nurse, James Jones. I've interviewed him, and I'll be presenting his side of the story. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Smith. I was the doctor involved in taking care of Mr. Anderson.
Hi, I'm Brian Baker, and I was the transporter involved in assisting the transportation of the patient. I've been an employee here for 5 years.
I am Sandy. I'm the respiratory therapy supervisor.
All right. Thank you for the introductions, and we will go ahead and start establishing a timeline for the events. Nurse Jones, are you able to walk us through the sequence of events from the moment the ICU transfer was ordered?
Again, I'll be speaking on behalf of Nurse Jones, and I did not tell you that I have only been a nurse manager on this unit for the last 4 months, so I'm so sorry I forgot to add that. But yes, in talking to James, the nurse, once the decision was made to transfer Mr. Anderson to the PCU, once the decision was made to transfer Mr. Anderson out of the PCU to the ICU, the PCU team helped move him to the stretcher. James, the nurse, turned on the portable oxygen tank, and he confirmed that it was on because he heard a hiss. It was on at 15 liters. And he ensured that the patient, Mr. Anderson, had his mask on properly. The transporter, Brian, began pushing the stretcher with James, and Dr. Smith accompanied the patient. About halfway there, James noticed that Mr. Anderson was turning blue and his breathing was sort of labored. That's when they checked the oxygen tank and realized there was actually no flow coming from the oxygen tank.
All right, great. Thank you. Now, during the transport, could you tell us your perspective as what happened during that process?
So like I said, I've been a transporter for 5 years here, and we've always, we were taught how to check the cylinders and make sure that the oxygen was flowing. However, in the last 6 months, the policy changed and we were no longer permitted to do that, and that was left to the responsibility of the clinical team. So when the patient was starting to decompensate, I assumed that the nursing team had already looked at the cylinder, and that the doctor had already looked at the cylinder, and so I didn't check it.
All right, great. Dr. Smith, what was your clinical assessment at the time that the issue was discovered?
So when we realized that the oxygen wasn't flowing, I attempted to adjust it myself. We couldn't get it to work. So I made the decision to push straight to the ICU instead of stopping off at another unit. In the moment, I felt like it was critical, and but maybe in hindsight, that decision may need reevaluation.
All right, great. Thank you. Now, I think it's important for us to take a look at the equipment and the support behind that. So from a respiratory standpoint, would you be able to provide some information on the use of the equipment?
Sure, of course. So after the incident, our team did inspect the tank, and we determined that it was full and in good working order, but it wasn't turned on properly. In order for the oxygen to flow, a cap needed to be removed in addition to turning the flow dial. If the valve wasn't opened, a brief hiss of oxygen may be heard, which it sounds like the team did hear that hiss, but there would be no further flow of oxygen. And when we went back and reviewed the tank, we noticed that the plastic cap was still in place and the valve was closed. So the oxygen was in fact not flowing for this patient.
All right, great. Thank you for those details. It's important to identify contributing factors in these cases, and so we'll start breaking down some of those. I'd like to get your thoughts on any potential contributing factors to this adverse event, and so we can start with our nurse manager.
I have been working with Dr. Smith on this, and we're using the 5 whys analysis. So we have it on our screen here. So we're just going to go along the cascade of events, or the 5 whys that we came up with for this. So the first one is, why did Mr. Anderson receive no oxygen during transportation? Because the portable oxygen tank was not delivering oxygen during the transport to the ICU. Why was the oxygen tank not delivering oxygen? Because the main valve was not turned on and the plastic safety cap was still in place, even though the flow meter was set at 15 liters. Why was the oxygen tank not properly turned on? Because neither the nurse nor the physician knew how to correctly operate the newer tank model. And I'll let you take the last 2.
And then why did none of the team members know how to operate the tank? Because training on the newer oxygen tank was incomplete, inconsistent, and unclear. The nurse and the doctor assumed it was someone else's responsibility, and the transporter was told not to handle the oxygen anymore. And then why was training incomplete or inconsistent? And that's because the policy change shifting responsibilities from the transporter to the nurses was poorly communicated. Not all of the staff knew their responsibilities, and there was no system in place to ensure relevant staff received proper training. Only 22% of the nurses had attended this training session.
All right, thank you. And now for transport, have you been trained at all to recognize and respond to any oxygen flow issues?
So, like I said, I knew how to operate the oxygen tank, but I was told that we were no longer supposed to be touching the oxygen tank. So, when the doctor and the nurse said that they had assessed it and that it wasn't faulty, I trusted them, and the doctor was pushing us to just get the patient to the ICU as quick as possible. So, I was just doing what the doctor told us.
Perfect. Okay. And for our respiratory team, are there any processes in place to maintain any sort of logs or maintenance of the portable tanks?
Unfortunately, there are not. So just to back up a little bit, we switched to these new oxygen tanks about 3 years ago, and there were some safety concerns at the time that prompted this change. A lot of times our tanks were being left on inadvertently, and this was causing fire hazards and causing a depletion of our oxygen supply unnecessarily. So we switched to these new tanks that had some safeguards to them, and these safeguards ended up causing a problem in the situation because the staff wasn't properly trained. So about 6 months ago, we did change our policy, and we determined that because oxygen needs to be prescribed, not just given, we thought it should fall in the hands of the clinical staff and not in the transporters. So that's why we made that change. But as you mentioned earlier, only 22% of the nurses had actually attended the training. So an email communication was sent out, but we didn't have a proper tracking mechanism to see what staff did attend the training, and we did not pull that information until after this incident occurred.
Okay, thank you. For Dr. Smith, when you think about the event at this point and in hindsight, would you have done anything differently?
Yes, this has really been an emotional time since this happened, since this situation happened. I do believe that I should have learned how to use the oxygen tank. I thought I knew what I was doing, and I believe that pushing through was the best thing for the patient. But now I kind of believe that we should have stopped at the nearest clinical unit for wall oxygen. I was acting under pressure and I was nervous and scared. I'm not gonna lie. But moving without oxygen probably contributed to the patient's decline.
I just wish someone would have asked me. I knew how to operate the tank, but I was scared to do anything because, we were told, very strongly that we were no longer allowed to touch the tank. But I might have could have saved this patient's life if someone would have just asked me.
And it's important to acknowledge that, work as a team, and the fair and just culture does speak to that, where you should feel like free to speak up. But stressful times, cause us to potentially do things that aren't in alignment. And that's why it's important to have these processes in place that everybody's educated on. And so I think that the next step is to identify system issues and communication. And so we can move on to that. And we'll start to kind of identify any potential breakdowns in communications or policies that may have impacted this case. And I'll start with the nurse manager. Are there any breakdowns or policies that you could identify in this case?
I was thinking we use checklists for multiple things in the PCU and in general. So there's no standardized checklist to verify the oxygen flow during critical transfers is actually happening. Also, there's no protocol for what to do if oxygen fails mid-transport. And as Brian mentioned, this ambiguity with roles and workflow assumptions is a big problem.
Thank you for sharing that. And for respiratory, any potential policies or communication improvements that you can identify?
Yeah, I feel like this incident definitely exposed some gaps in our implementation process. I was under the impression that because I had put together the education and sent an email communication, that everything would fall into place and people would do what was asked in the email. But looking back, there wasn't a good tracking system to understand who had received the training. And I think making the training mandatory and making sure that the people receiving that email understood the sense of urgency, having a proper timeline for implementation where people were aware of when the change would take place, and maybe even educating the transporter staff on what to do in case they were in a situation such as that, to maybe help and feel comfortable talking to the physician and the nurse during transport. I think if we standardize the training and provide a method of verification of people receiving the training, that could have helped avoid this incident.
All right. And finally, from our physician, how could we improve real-time decision-making in situations like this? Do you have any insight into that?
Moving forward from a physician standpoint, doing more some training for rapid deteriorating patients during transport would help. And it would also help prepare the staff to evaluate whether stopping or continuing would be best. I would also maybe suggest if a patient is going from one level of care to a higher level of care, maybe we need to have staff from that higher level of care to have that more experience. Staff member involved with the patient care during transport.
Great. Yeah, simulations can certainly help identify these areas and prepare staff for these things when they happen. All right. Well, thank you everybody for your insight into this case. It's been very helpful. And again, when you review these, you come up with recommendations, and it's important to identify an action plan together to help prevent events like this from occurring again moving forward. And so I'll just highlight some of the areas that that we could probably focus on as recommendations in development of those action plans. It's oxygen verification. We've mentioned developing a checklist to confirm not only the presence of the pressure in the oxygen cylinders, but to also look at the oxygen flow through the mask before transport and to verify that everything is functioning appropriately. Potentially looking at the transport response guidelines. Oftentimes decision trees are useful tools and that can be dispersed on a broader scale to multiple areas to get everybody on the same page with what that response looks like. It sounds like from our respiratory team, equipment auditing and labeling and reinforcing monthly inspection policies and creating logs that we are ensuring are getting filled out. Education and simulation, as Dr. Smith suggested, to look at how we can provide simulation and additional training for these types of situations and how to respond during a decompensating patient during transport. And then looking at implementing a potential backup plan if oxygen fails, especially for these critically ill patients when they're transferring between units, especially to the ICU. Any additional items or information that you would like to add?
I just would like to point out that this communication failure in healthcare, which happens, in probably other businesses too, according to the Joint Commission, 7 out of 10 sentinel events involves some degree of communication breakdown and policy changes. And I think that's what we've seen here. It's unfortunate that the patient passed and expired. It's very unfortunate. And hopefully the moral injury on the staff won't be too bad, nor any litigation that we face from this family. Thank you.
Anything else from the group?
I've really been struggling even sleeping at night. This has really bothered me so much. And I was up one night just kind of reading about equipment malfunction, and I found online that the most common reason that equipment malfunctions is user error, and which is exactly what happened here. We didn't use our oxygen tank correctly, and subsequently our patient decompensated. I even learned that there have been 83,000 deaths related to equipment malfunction, and 1.7 million injuries, which is just quite a large number and really scary. So I'm glad that we're all here to talk about this, so it doesn't hopefully happen again in our institution.
Yeah, and that does show that it is a big issue, and no matter how well the plan is designed, there's obviously still things that can happen. It'll be important for you to seek out resources, for staff support. These are challenging times, and can certainly provide or end in a lot of additional stress from an adverse event like this. And just thank you again. This was a difficult but necessary discussion. We will need to put an action plan together, and typically there are timelines associated with that. So we will follow up from a risk management perspective to see where the progress is on that. Typically, the action plan is due within about 45 days, and we will have to have that implemented within a few months. And then it will require auditing on the back end from the supervisors and other teams with usually about a 90% compliance rate. So we do want to make sure that we come up with a good system that can be implemented and that it can be sustained, and that we are ensuring that we are following those new suggestions and policies that we put in place. All right. Thank you again for joining in this discussion.